Hello, I'm Caitlin Self, the moderator for the Nutrition and Herbal Collective's CNS Prep Course. And today we're talking about how to create your own practice tests for the CNS exam. So obviously there are a lot of practice tests that you can get online, and in our course, we offer some practice tests for our students as well. But sometimes you want to create your own because some of the practice tests online aren't available, or you just want more questions. So I'm going to give you some tips for how you can do that. And bear in mind that I did create the practice test for my study group back when I took it, and I've created additional practice tests since then for others. So this is based on my experience, but I'm sure there are lots of different ways to do this. So I hope that these tips are helpful. The first thing I recommend doing is just get a little bit organized, figure out who's going to be in the group and who's going to be taking the test so that you can start developing questions. So you want to start with maybe 50 to 100 questions at most. When we're thinking about the CNS exam, it's a 200 question multiple choice exam. You don't need to do a 200 question practice test. Even though we have test taking anxiety and it's really good to go through the process and practice as much as you can, by sitting down to a full 200 question test, even if it's a practice test, it's more likely to give you a little bit of that burnout. And I find that in students, it often makes things a little bit worse and makes them a little bit more nervous for the exam. Whereas if you keep it to a shorter test or you do it in segments, I find that it's really helpful with just kind of getting more comfortable with the questions, sitting in the room, taking the exam. So somewhere in that 50 to 100 question range is what I recommend aiming for. And then you can start by just gathering some questions from Quizlet or the Medical Nutrition and Case Studies book. That's a really good way to just kind of fill in some of the questions that everyone will be able to take on the practice test. However, the benefit of having a study group is that you can all create questions. And that means that whoever has decided to volunteer to organize this test for the group will get questions that they haven't seen before. So if I were to just create a test for my group, obviously I've seen all the questions. So the way that I recommend doing this is actually utilizing something like Google Forms, where you can have each of the members of your study group create maybe 10 or 15 questions, depending on the size of your group, and submitting them through Google Forms. You want to make sure that you have the question, you also have the answer, and then usually I think it's a good idea to have a section at the bottom where they can put a source or a citation where they kind of source that question from, because these are all CNS candidates putting these questions together, and sometimes you may want to double check an answer, or you might want to get more information. It's good to, say if you got this question or this information from Krauss chapter 9 or something like that. So when it's time to send that out, you can use the Google form to collect the questions and answers, but keep in mind that you don't need to only use multiple choice questions for the practice test. The practice test is it can take a lot of time to create this entire test, and multiple choice questions take much longer, especially because you're trying to put multiple choice options that don't make it super obvious what the answer is. So I actually recommend that you do mostly multiple choice, but also a couple of fill in the blank style or essay style questions per person. That way you can all go over the practice test results together to determine the right answer, and it just makes it a little bit less of a burden for everybody who's participating and creating questions. And you've got a lot going on. You don't want to spend hours and hours creating the perfect practice test. That's the really nice thing about using the hive mind of your study group. So you'll get some new to you questions also written in a way that might be different from how your own brain works, which helps you to start thinking in a different way about the topic again. Now that you have all of your questions submitted by your group mates from your study group, you're just going to open up that Google document, so the Google form, and you can click on the responses spreadsheet that's available, and you'll see all of the questions submitted. You can choose to resort them if you want, because then someone might not remember if that's their question or not. So instead of it being, oh, these are all of Ashley's questions and these are all of Julie's questions, you can kind of resort them if you want to have them all mixed together. And then once you've resorted them, then you can number them by just adding a column all the way to the left, and then you can copy and paste it without the answer key into a word processor doc like Google Docs or even Microsoft Word, so that you can share that either as a PDF or as a file or as a link. And that's optional. You don't have to do all of those additional steps if you don't want to, but I do think it makes for a slightly easier process, especially when you're going through and kind of grading your own work. But I do find that that works best. That is the simplest way to kind of get the practice test together. And a couple of things that you can do ahead of time is you can talk to your group mates and determine, okay, what are some of the areas that we're struggling with or that we want to make sure there are additional questions on. So you can say, oh, we are really interested in getting more information about drug nutrient interactions or more biochemistry, or maybe some of the basic SNP questions, those single nucleotide polymorphisms. There are going to be a couple of those in there. So whatever feels right to you. I know for us, we didn't have a lot of materials on herbalism, and that wasn't covered in our exam. And then we took the test, and it was one of the first years that they had more herbal questions on there. So that was kind of some advice to the next group, like, okay, we didn't have any of this on board. Make sure that you include herbal questions, herbal studies, things like that when you're going through. So then you've got your test all ready to go. You've created all of your questions. You pulled some things from Quizlet. Your friends submitted some of the questions. Everything is organized, and it's simple. It's easy. It really shouldn't take too much time to get all of that together. The making of the questions itself is really where the effort comes in. So I thought it would be really interesting to think about, sort of the cheater's route to this. Now that artificial intelligence is so popular, while I was preparing for this live, I said, hey, I wonder if something like ChatGPT would be useful at helping us to create some questions for preparing for the CNS exam. Well, I am going to read some of the responses that I received when I tried this out. I think it's really interesting, but I'll give you a couple of questions. So basically, I just asked the prompt, can you create 10 multiple choice practice questions for the Certified Nutrition Specialist exam? I said, please include drug nutrient interaction questions. And so they gave me 10 questions, but the first question is, which of the following is a good source of complex carbohydrates? White bread, fruit juice, whole grain pasta, or sugary cereal? Very, very simple, easy question. I would be shocked if that was on the CNS exam. Kind of a waste of time. And some of the questions were actually on that level, relatively simple, but then, there were a few that I think were a little bit more interesting, maybe a little bit more worthwhile. For example, which of the following is a common side effect of consuming excessive amounts of vitamin A? A, nausea, B, diarrhea, C, hair loss, D, muscle weakness. So that one is a little bit trickier because you really kind of have to think about it. There are a number of symptoms associated with vitamin A. Now, for ChatGPT, the answer that they provided was hair loss, which is correct. However, there can be other sort of muscular and neurological related symptoms with vitamin A toxicity. So that is a little bit of a tricky question that you might want to kind of look a little bit more deeply into the specifics, where you want to make sure even though what ChatGPT is providing is kind of a little more straightforward. So what I learned from this, and then after I kind of created 10 of those questions on there, what I learned is that they do have the ability, this program does have the ability to create these questions, and they're mostly accurate, but a lot of them weren't that great. So I put the 10 questions in the blog post that's associated with this video. So after you watch this video, tomorrow this video will go up on the resource hub on the Nutrition and Herbal Collective, and I recommend going to that blog and taking a look at those practice questions and let us know what you think. I thought they were, for the most part, pretty easy and straightforward, so it might not be really a good use of your time. Now, once you've created the practice test, I recommend that you make sure there's time between when you finish creating the practice test and actually taking the practice test. And you can make multiple practice tests, but at least one of those tests I recommend treating as a dress rehearsal. So, trying to take it maybe in a similar time of day as when you're going to take it, taking it the same way that you plan on taking the actual exam. So, if you're going to do the handwritten exam with a proctor, making sure you have a handwritten copy of the practice test, or if it's going to be online, doing a digital copy, just so you have a little bit of those similarities and you kind of treat it like a dry run. And then make sure that you have, a limited time to complete the test. You're in a quiet space with no interruptions or distractions. Maybe your study group can take the test all together, some doing handwritten, some on the computer with no talking, and then you leave that room and go into another room when you finish so that it has a little bit of that test vibe. I don't think that's necessary more than once, but I think it is useful to do at least one time in the couple of weeks leading up to the exam itself, just to help you sort of prepare. And like I said, I kind of refer to that as a little bit of a dress rehearsal. Um, so when you kind of give yourself a little bit of time in between completing the test and then taking the test, that will also help you forget a little bit of your own questions. They'll just be a little bit less fresh in your memory, which is very useful. And then you'll sit down and create this environment that's very similar to what the test will be. And hopefully that will help you with your test anxiety, as well as just making you feel more prepared to sit down and complete this exam. So, like I said, within 24 hours of this, you will also see the blog post that we have associated with this live, so you can get a little bit more information there. But I hope that this is useful to you. I like to keep it as sort of succinct as I can. And good luck with your studies. We'll see you online. Take care.